Welcome back to Jail Psychologist. Today we're doing a special episode on the parallels between cutting taxes and smoking methamphetamine. On the surface, these two things don't seem to have much in common. But when you compare the behavioral economics of tax cuts to the psychology of methamphetamine use, they're not all that different. Let's start by understanding methamphetamine, and then we'll talk about tax cuts and wrap up by drawing parallels between the two. Okay, methamphetamine. I'll start by admitting that I have never smoked meth, but I know a lot of people who have. Methamphetamine, like all amphetamines, is a stimulant. It gives you energy, motivation, and increases cognitive speed. And note that I said cognitive speed and not cognitive accuracy. If you've ever spoken to someone who's high on meth, you'll notice that they talk very quickly, but what's coming out of their mouth doesn't always make sense or reflect good judgment. Another important aspect of methamphetamine is that it floods your brain with dopamine and makes you feel very good, but only temporarily. When your high goes away, you're right back to where you started, only now you have less money in your pocket. Okay, now let's talk about tax cuts. There are many kinds of taxes and many ways to cut them. The US tax code is something like 1,000 pages long, so for our purposes, let's keep it simple and talk about a hypothetical income tax that currently sits at 20% and we're considering cutting it in half to 10%. How does this impact the taxpayer? It kind of depends on how much money you make, but table that for a moment. Tax cuts, broadly speaking, have two main financial impacts. The first is that they directly put more money in your pocket. Let's say you make $50,000 a year. If the tax rate goes from 20% to 10%, you will have $5,000 more in your pocket to spend. The second financial impact is that your government has $5,000 less to invest into public goods and services like roads and schools and the fire department. And these are all services that we need, without which our societies couldn't function. In short, tax cuts give citizens immediate liquid capital by diverting capital that would otherwise have been used to improve their community. So that's methamphetamine and tax cuts in a nutshell. Now for the interesting part. How are these two things alike? First, neither of these activities really benefit the people who want them. Smoking meth makes you feel happiness and relief, but only for a few hours. When the high wears off, all of your stress and all of your problems come back. So who really benefits from you smoking meth? The dealer who sold it to you and the chemist who manufactured it. So what about tax cuts? You might say, but I get cash in my pocket, how am I losing? And yes, I did say that, and tax cuts do provide short-term relief to average people. But in order to understand how you are not the primary beneficiary of tax cuts, we need to go back to my point about how tax cuts hit differently depending on how much money you make. In our previous example, a person making $50,000 per year would have $5,000 more cash in his pocket with the 10% tax cut. But what about a person making $2 million per year? The same tax cut is going to put $200,000 more in his pocket. Okay, good for him, right? What do we care? Well, you have to understand that the money going into his pocket would have been spent on public services. The two takeaways here are, 1, a tax cut is not free money, it's shifting money from public services and putting it in your pocket. And 2, tax cuts disproportionately benefit high-earning and wealthy people. I want to give you an example to show how all this works. Imagine that you have a hypothetical town with 10 people in it. 9 of these people make $50,000 a year, and 1 person makes $2 million per year. The tax cut saved 9 of the townspeople $5,000 each, and 1 of the townspeople $200,000. Now what about the government? It loses $245,000 in tax revenue. Now why does this matter? Well, the community needs road maintenance, which costs $100,000 a year, the police department costs $200,000 a year to operate, and the fire department costs another $100,000 per year to operate, for a total of $400,000. The town's operating costs are $400,000. But after the tax cut, revenue drops from $490,000 a year to $245,000. That means that they're going to have a budget shortfall. So they're going to have to cut some services to stay within their budget. So let's say they cut the entire budget for road maintenance and make up the rest of the budget shortfall by cutting from the fire department. Great. This probably works out just fine in the near term, but over time, the roads start to wear out, and with no budget to maintain or repair them, several potholes form on the roads. Pretend you're a citizen in this town. One day you're driving to work and a nasty pothole messes up your whole suspension. Now you need $3,000 of repairs for your car. The next weekend, a small brush fire at the local park grows out of control because the fire department had to cut their staff and can no longer afford 24/7 coverage. It takes them so long to get there that the park that cost $25,000 to build was completely destroyed. Between the car repairs and the destroyed park, you're now down $500 even after the tax cut. In practical terms, what has happened is that, very much like smoking methamphetamine, the tax cut felt good right after it happened, but after a while you realize that your body, in the case of methamphetamine, and your town, in the case of tax cuts, are worse off than you were before. And now you have even less money. Now, you might be wondering why so many people in the town voted for a tax cut, when in reality, one person in the town is getting about 82% of the benefit. And to be honest with you, I don't think most people are ignorant or irrational, but I do think they're making decisions under stress, with incomplete information and a very short time horizon. I try to make these videos digestible for lay people, but I need to mention two behavioral phenomena for a second because they're very relevant to our discussion. First, there's a principle in behavioral economics called hyperbolic discounting. It holds that the more stressed out people are, the more they prioritize short-term rewards, and the more they tend to ignore long-term consequences. Second, people who feel socially disconnected also tend to prioritize short-term rewards over long-term consequences. So, how does this apply to our discussion? Well, most people who smoke methamphetamine do it because they're stressed out, depressed, and lonely. Meth makes them feel good again, and it makes them forget about their problems, if only for a few hours. They don't worry about the long-term damage they're doing to their bodies, their relationships, or their communities. Tax cuts work the same way. People who are financially stable and have a good connection to their community tend to want the community to be well-resourced and to provide services for everyone over a long time horizon. However, people who are financially struggling and don't feel connected to their communities are in a hyperbolic discounting mode. They want cash in their pocket immediately, and they tend not to think about the long-term consequences for their communities. Whether you're talking about using methamphetamine or cutting taxes, what you're ultimately doing is borrowing happiness from tomorrow. Okay, so the next way that methamphetamine and tax cuts are similar is that the more you do them, the more you need them. With methamphetamine, what happens is that you smoke meth, your brain gets a dopamine bath, and you feel good. But then your high wears off and you need to smoke again. And this goes on and on. After a while, your brain eventually adapts to the high amount of dopamine you're cramming in there. Then, when you stop doing meth, your brain basically goes into nuclear meltdown mode because it can't function without it anymore. At that point, you become desperate to get more meth and may find that you're willing to do just about anything to make the pain stop. So what about tax cuts? Well, think about our example from earlier. Joe gets a $5,000 tax cut, but ends up needing thousands of dollars of repairs for his car because the roads in his town are no longer being maintained. But guess what? Even after that, the roads still aren't being maintained. 2 months later, Joe hits another pothole, and this time gets damage to his undercarriage and his steering system. Now he's looking at another $3,000 of damages to his car. Joe has already burned through the money he saved from the tax cut. He can't afford to fix his car. But he's so stressed and financially desperate that his brain is operating in hyperbolic discounting mode. So what does he do? He votes for another tax cut. And the cycle repeats. The more taxes get cut, the more tax cuts Joe feels like he needs in order to cope with the reduction in public services. So just like methamphetamine, tax cuts become more addictive the more you do them. So the last thing that tax cuts and methamphetamine have in common is that when you eventually hit bottom and decide that you need to stop, you're going to go through withdrawal. We sort of already discussed methamphetamine withdrawal. What happens with tax cuts is that by the time you realize that your public services have been decimated and you're going to need to raise taxes for your community to even function, a large part of your population is already tapped out. Just like getting someone with a meth addiction into recovery, you're going to have a very hard time convincing financially desperate people to accept a tax increase. And because this is secretly, or not so secretly at this point, an economics channel, I can't help but point out that this is almost exactly the situation in which the United States now finds itself. The US debt is, as of February 2026, over $38.5 trillion. As a country, we've racked up an absolutely ludicrous amount of debt due to overspending and repeated tax cuts for the past 25 years. And as I have stated several times before, the financial benefits of these tax cuts have gone overwhelmingly to the wealthiest members of our society, while the social consequences have been borne entirely by working people. But I do have some good news. Just like methamphetamine dependence, there is a treatment for a society addicted to tax cuts. If you rule out higher taxes on working people and you rule out more borrowing, there are very few places left for that money to come from. At that point, whether you like it or not, your only option is to tax accumulated wealth. It doesn't take any money from your paycheck because your paycheck is income, not wealth. What it does do is shift some of the money that has become extremely concentrated in our society from the top 1% of wealthy citizens back to the public services that have been cut so dramatically, and begin rebuilding the public supports that young adults, who now have the highest rates of depression in decades, are missing. It can be difficult to convince someone with an addiction that they have a problem and that treatment can help. So it goes with a society addicted to cutting taxes. But whether it's therapy or a wealth tax, the work you put in to make a change is worth it in the long run. What we know for sure won't work is continuing to do what got us into this mess in the first place. If you want to know more about all this, I recommend you go back and watch episodes 1 through 5 of this video series. As always, please let me know if you have thoughts, questions, or things you want to hear more about in a future video. That's all the time we have for our session today. I'll see you next week.